Welcome to the Long Take Review, where 4 college professors talk film, providing insight, not assigning homework. I'm your host, Jen Sipchak-Bankard, and I'm here with 3 writers and critics who prophesize with their pens. First, he don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. It's Antonio Elefano. How are you doing, Antonio?
Songs are like an oil painting at the dentist's office. I'm doing great, Jen.
I love that.
Kind of an ass, Antonio.
Greg, it's not even your turn yet. Just wait. Can you just wait?
I saw you not doing it, and I had to. I had to do it.
And he could have done better, but I don't mind. He just kind of wasted my precious time. It's PT McNiff. How's it going, PT?
Everyone asks where these songs come from, Sylvie, but then you watch their faces, and they're not asking where the songs come from. They're asking why the songs didn't come to them. I'm doing well, Jen. How are you?
I'm doing great. See, Greg? Now you can say it. It's your turn. Hold on. And last but not least, ain't it hard when you discover that he really wasn't where it's at after he took from you everything he could steal? It's Greg Cass. Greg, how does it feel?
How does it feel to be on your own with no direction home, like a complete unknown? And I'm tired of rhyming, Jen. Stop me, please.
You didn't even get to the Rolling Stone part. That was amazing.
I lost faith in my voice. The other 2 had mastered the voice. I heard some hours of rehearsal in their tones, so I got embarrassed and scared. But obviously, I'm very excited to be here, Jen. Thank you so much. Let's talk about this movie.
Yeah, let's do it. So, listeners, those were all references. If Greg's singing doesn't tip you off, I don't know what will. But those were all references to the film we are here to review today, A Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan biopic covering his 4-year journey from first arriving in New York City through going electric in 1965. The movie was co-written and directed by James Mangold, who previously directed prestige dramas Walk the Line and Ford v Ferrari, as well as fandom films like Logan, and no other movies I can think of naming right now. All right, of course. He also directed Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. That was just for you, Greg.
Boo, overrated. Who loves that film?
All the singing and instrumentation in the movie was done on set by the actors, including Timothee Chalamet, another pod fave, as Bob Dylan, Monica Barbaro as Joan Baez, Oscar nominee Monica Barbaro, and Edward Norton as Pete Seeger. Or maybe I should say that, in fact, all 3 of them have been nominated for their Academy Awards for their performances here. Mangold himself also has 3 nominations for the movie as producer, director, and writer. And let me say, James Mangold making it to director, the Best Director category, was a huge shock. Not many people were predicting that. And, this movie, as we talked about in our Oscar nominations reaction episode, which you should definitely check out, we really concluded that this movie it's on its way up with momentum in the Oscar race. So it's really the perfect time for us to be reviewing it. But if you're listening to us for the first time and are tired of hearing me talk, because that was a lot of me talking, we'll have spoiler-free section designed for those who have not yet seen the film. And then, with a very clear alert, we will shift into spoiler mode for the rest of the show. PT, if after listening to this episode, people want to come gather around wherever they roam, what can they do?
Yes, and how many times must a man look up before he can see the sky? Yes, and how many ears must one man have before he can hear the latest episodes of the Long Take Review? In the jingle jangle morning, you'll come following the show wherever you get your podcasts. We host the show on Jen's Substack, thelongtake.substack.com, but you can duck down the alleyway looking for a new friend on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Overcast, or wherever you get your episodes. If you saw 10,000 talkers whose tongues were all broken, you may be on social media where you can follow us on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at The Long Take Review. But yes, I think it can be very easily done. Check us out on Letterboxd. The account is at LTRpod, where you can search for us for our individual accounts via the hashtag LTRpod, because it's all right, Ma. I'm only logging. Jen?
Thanks, BT. Wow.
Sorry to interrupt. I've just been handed a Nobel Prize for Literature, and it's to PT. It's for all that work. So congratulations.
Well, I won't accept it in light of things. I will not be there at the ceremony.
Thanks, PT. So we'll start with the short take What was our general reaction to A Complete Unknown? How does A Complete Unknown feel?
I will go first based on the gestures on screen. So, I made no small bones about the fact this was my number one for the year, which I recognize makes me some kind of boomer, and I'll take it. Short take on this one is this is at once exactly what you expect it to be and something different and more special than it has a right to be. And I think this continues to be the film I'm thinking about the most from last year because of the central performances, particularly the three nominated actors, and then I would add in Elle Fanning, who is very memorable. And then beyond that, for me, I didn't have a relationship with Bob Dylan, and this to me opened up his songwriting, his music, and kind of helped me peek inside this world I had previously not really known. And so, when I first, I all joking included, I think about James Mangold for his nerd content. I had seen Walk the Line when it came out. I think I own it on DVD, but it's not something I return to a lot. And so the fact that he returned to this genre is like shocking. And to me, the fact that it worked so well is even more shocking because a lot has happened between Walk the Line and this film to make the music biopic more complicated. And I just thought this both embraced and ignored that in beautiful ways.
I don't know if anyone here loves the movie as much as Greg does, but I really, really liked this movie. I enjoyed it quite a bit. My short take is, that it is a music biopic, but I think it does so many things right to both be the best version of a music biopic and also to undercut and undermine that sort of like the Dewey Cox problem, which is that like Walk Hard came out after Walk the Line. And it's so easy to watch a music biopic and be like, yep, those are the beats that were parodied in that movie. And, this movie like has those moments where it's heading in that direction and then does something, has some element, makes really smart choices to undercut that. So yeah, I think it's, my short take, which maybe is I'm not going to say that. Cut that part out. It was really good. Antonio?
Like Greg, I didn't have that much familiarity with Bob Dylan's work. Like I knew some of his songs I was a fan of, but um, and I remember watching it on Christmas Day. Like my sister and my wife both wanted to see different things. I was like, no, A Complete Unknown. So we watched it, and they were reluctant to see it, but at the end they both really loved it as much as I did, I think, which again I think is a credit to the film, that it can make you, even people who aren't diehard fans can really appreciate its themes about artistry versus commerciality, what drives an artist through the lens of one of America's most singular visionaries. I think this was a really challenging film to pull off well, given the adoration of its subject. I mean, and given that there's already at least one like very notable Oscar-nominated film that covered Bob Dylan in a very interesting way too. And I think Mangold and Chalamet especially rose to the challenge and gave us a movie that was both satisfying for hardcore fans and interesting for people discovering Dylan for the first time. Jen, what do you think?
This should not have worked. This movie should not have worked. It's a miracle. That's honestly. And I had heard nothing but skepticism leading up to this movie. And so here's the thing. I thought I didn't have a relationship with Dylan in terms of prior knowledge. I went into it being like, oh, this will be fun. I'll get to learn about Bob Dylan. And every 5 minutes there was another song where like, and this is a Bob Dylan song. And this one, oh, and then like, the even the Joan Baez songs, I'm like, this song, wow, like, and so I was grinning from ear to ear pretty much the whole movie, and because I had thought I knew nothing about it, but it turned out I knew all the music, and just didn't know the context in which that music was made or performed or circulated, right? And so that was the primary joy to me, is that it really seems to put the songs at the forefront. And I'm curious in like thesis please or our later discussion, maybe in spoiler mode, of like, what is this movie doing beyond like recreating these songs in a really dynamic and joyful way, because there's barely any talking in between the songs. I feel like and so part of me stopped every once in a while to be like, because I feel like it's like a river cruise where you're just sort of along for the ride, you're bobbing along, and you're like, it never stops. I feel like it's kind of relentless in its like, oh, you want this, like, oh, we're gonna play another, oh, you like this song too. And the performances are so impeccable. Like Timothée Chalamet is again, it should not have worked. I should have been like, why is Willy Wonka playing an electric guitar? But instead, I really never expected to say that he disappears into the role. I stopped thinking of him as Timothée Chalamet at some point and was like, oh, this must be Bob Dylan, which is incredible. Again, should not have worked. So I'm really astounded by how much I like this movie. I'm still questioning sort of like what the actual substance of it is as a story and as a film, beyond like, wasn't Bob Dylan great and don't we love the music that he made, and let's peer into this like really interesting moment in American music history. But I'm hoping our conversation will fill that in for me.
Jen, it's a different movie this year that's about the substance. You won't find it here.
That was your mistake.
Thanks. I don't know why I didn't see that coming. Anyway, the recommendation algorithm, we actually for once haven't sort of stepped on this yet, but this is the section where we establish the audience of a film. So it sounds like out of the four of us, PT maybe is the only one who had kind of significant prior knowledge of Bob Dylan going into this. Do we think that's necessary? It sounds like the answer is no based on our reactions, but does that help or hurt your viewing experience?
Yeah, my understanding is for the four of us, I was like, oh, I'm the Bob Dylan fan. But I think about the people I know who are like, I bought the 32 disc Rolling Thunder Review box set that has like all the bootleg concerts that now are officially like, oh my God. So those are the real Bob Dylan fans. And unfortunately, the people I know personally who are at that level have not had a chance to see the movie yet for various life reasons. And because they are not people like us, they're not on the sicko side of the scale who go run out to see movies on Christmas Day or soon thereafter. So that's I don't have direct firsthand contact from them, but I've heard from some other people. If you're super deep and you're at the level of like, actually that person wouldn't have had that conversation in 1963, that's something from 1962, then like it could trip you up. But for the most part, I think this has been something that you have to be like way too committed to historical accuracy and your accumulation of lore and knowledge for it to be a problem. The people who love Bob Dylan seem to love and enjoy this movie. People who have no interest in hearing about Bob Dylan who have seen it seem to like it. Jasmine is one of those people. She went in being like, I'm not interested in Bob Dylan. I don't think that I will be able to see Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan. He's just going to be the Jenner's boyfriend to her. And she walked out being like, true believer in both. The songs are great and the performance was great. So yeah, I think that in terms of the algorithm, I think basically anywhere on a regular size spectrum of fandom, you could enjoy this. I think that the hump for people to get over is the music biopic part. I do know people, we all know people who have seen it, who are like, no, like it's still too cliched. I still don't like that. I can't get on board with the musical biopic thing. I think, once we get into spoiler mode, I would like to unpack how I think it does a better job than normal of doing that. But, there might be people who just on a fundamental level can't handle that. And I understand if you think that's where you are, I would say still give it a try, but it may not win you over. But otherwise, I feel like it's 4-quadrant, baby. This is hitting everywhere.
I agree with that. I think that, my wife and my sister, I think, are fans of the standard biopic, right? Like Walk the Line, Ray. Those are things that they're interested in, both because it gives them some context about, famous figures that they're interested in, and they like the beats of like a standard, musical biopic. There's something that you can sort of anticipate. It feels familiar. But I think that this lies somewhere between those films and then Todd Haynes' I'm Not There. And I think it's telling that for someone who was portrayed by Kate Blanchett, right, and Oscar nominated Kate Blanchett for playing Bob Dylan, that I still prefer maybe Timothee Chalamet's performance over her, right? That's telling. So I think that PT's right, that that if that's what if that's what you're expecting, it will satisfy all of those things, but it's more interesting than that, I think. And you know, I understand the complaints. We'll get into that in spoiler mode. I think that they're overblown, or I'm not exactly sure what version of that this movie they would want, really, that could still honor Bob Dylan and his music well. But we'll talk about that later. Greg, what do you think?
I'm thinking we should have it be about Bob Dylan, but he's a CGI monkey. It's never been done. We should just go for it. No, I'm basically going to agree with the two of you and just provide the evidence from my screening. So I, snatched up a ticket to the sneak preview. We're putting it on IMAX for one night before the general release on Christmas, and that, largely speaking, just brings out the pudgy white film bros, myself gracefully included. That tends to be who's in the crowd, and we are all like, where's my collectible lanyards? And then I got inside and I, looked at my brothers, all of us with our own individual large popcorns, just going to town. Thank you, Maria Menounos. We'll eat our popcorn while you're speaking to us. But then as the crowd filtered in, there were a lot of good old-fashioned hippies in the crowd. And, I'm from outside of Boston, and the Cambridge hippies, who have been Cambridge hippies for since before the movement even took off, they don't tend to come out to the suburbs. But this was the kind of movie that they heard about the preview screening and didn't wait for it to come to the little independent art house theater, which I think says everything about who really wanted to see this. And there was a lovely older couple in front of me wearing just macrame vests, smelling like just a little bit of patchouli, great in all those ways that old hippies are. And the film ended, and it had been advertised as having a Q&A with James Mangold attached at the end. And for whatever reason, my theater didn't play it. And this couple knew that. They're like, where's the Q&A? Now, they thought he was going to be there in person, which is a little bridge too far because, why would he be in suburban Boston on a Wednesday night? But it showed me that there was such enthusiasm and such passion in a crowd that wouldn't necessarily usually follow the making of preview screenings behind the scenes. And I think that remained true. I talked to one good friend who saw it with a diehard Dylan fan from the Kind of Rise, and I believe the one complaint, I hope he doesn't get mad with me sharing this, I believe the one complaint he had is that the crowds go crazy for Dylan on the streets in Greenwich Village, and she was like, nope, everybody was too cool to do that. Nobody would have done that. They would have given the nod or just kind of gestured.
This isn't Elvis.
People. Yeah, exactly right. So and then the most cliche of cliches, I love Guillermo del Toro, but when in the DGA podcast, when Guillermo sat down with James Mangold, Guillermo's like, you made the perfect movie to go with Llewyn Davis. And it was like, well, yeah, Guillermo, of course he did. But if that really spoke to you, if you really liked the music in that film, that's obviously not a Dylan biopic, but that is still the superior movie. But it is a really good kind of companion piece, as Guillermo del Toro will tell you all. Jen, what did Guillermo del Toro tell you?
He told me that Oscar Isaac's going to be a great Frankenstein. Sorry to veer off into movie news for a second, but the stills from that came out the other day, and I was like, yes, let's go. Anyway, I would agree that Inside Llewyn Davis, still a better movie, also has a cat. But it's also a companion movie, I think is the right term, because in a lot of ways, that movie is kind of the gritty, seedy underbelly of this movie, because it is, to me at least, it's more, Inside Llewyn Davis is more focused on sort of the what happens when you don't hit it big like Bob Dylan. Whereas this is really wow, Bob Dylan's so mythological at this point. How do we even tell a movie about him, right? So, and it's kind of wrestling with that. problem, I think, in some ways. I think the only thing I'll add to recommendation algorithm real quick is if you have no attachment to Bob Dylan or even folk music or even, American music history, if you are just like, give me that period drama Americana, this movie will do right by you. It's like the production design, the set design, the costumes, like all of that stuff really takes you. If you're nostalgic for this period in time that I said earlier, and I can't remember the year, but then this movie is for you. Like, you don't even necessarily need to care about the music to sort of be invested in the story potentially, because it is so focused on a certain period in Dylan's history, right? But yeah. All right, I think it sounds like we're ready for spoiler mode. If you have not seen A Complete Unknown and you do not want it spoiled, I guess to what extent can you spoil Bob Dylan's biography and all of his music? But that said, if you want to go into the movie fresh, here's the place to bow out, catch a cab in the street, and head home.
We should have commissioned like an acoustic guitar version.
Yes,
of all
I was
of our
just
bumper
thinking that
music.
as it was. Yeah, I was thinking that too.
Oh,
I was like, the unplugged version of this would have been really great.
Yeah.
But I have no idea how to even begin to go about doing that. So there we go.
They have machines that could probably do it now.
That's true.
I'm sure
yeah.
that would be great.
Well, first you sleep with Joan Baez, then you sit at her little writing desk in the middle of the night.
Sacrifices must be made.
Okay, so I want to kind of start with a kind of fun question, and this is what Antonio posed to me after I was texting all of you because I was the last one to see this movie. Are you on Team Sylvie or Team Joan? We might have all the same answer. I'm actually not sure, but
I'm on team. They both deserve better.
You're on Team Treat Women Better. That would be
Exactly.
a smart answer.
I'm Team Joan. I'm Team Joan. What about you, Greg?
It's such an interesting love triangle, and I use that even though it kind of fails to be that way. Actually, maybe specifically to unpack that comment, it's like only in the last bit of the movie that it kind of gets wedged into a love triangle, and it was like I hadn't really thought of it that way up until that moment, so it was a little tricky. But there's this phrase, it's probably misogynist, but people say they have their work spouse who's like the colleague you work really well with and you like click with, and yet like you feel a little guilty because you're like, well, I should be going home and being with my actual spouse, but like I have so much fun with my work spouse. And that's what the love triangle felt like to me. It's like Joan and Bob kind of hate each other, especially in those later stages. And boy, do I love them shooting daggers at each other while, into the microphone as they sing the beautiful song together. So I kind of love that dynamic of like, we hate each other, but we create magic, and, it's got to be there, and we both need each other. So I think I'm Team Joan is my long answer. Also, Monica Barbaro forever. She's so good in this movie. So I've never been an Elle Fanning fan. I'm sorry. I'm not a big Fannings fan. Attorneys General.
Well, Greg, not to anything you just said, but to your earlier point about the love triangle maybe feeling squeezed in, that is one of the key complaints, to the degree people complain about it, about the timeline, is the Elle Fanning character, whose name is Sylvie in the movie, is based on a person of a different name. I think it's a Sarah or a Sally. And there's a apparently like a long-standing Bob Dylan thing if he doesn't want that person named, just like for their own like protection, because I guess there was a window of time in the 70s when she was like, please don't, I don't want to be associated for this like very short relationship I had with someone who got very famous. But it's just, the actual history is that relationship ended long before Dylan met Baez, let alone the performances where at the folk festival where they're singing into the same microphone, and in the movie Elle Fanning is off to the side, and that's a great scene, both like her watching and sort of her emotional reaction to what she's seeing and the two of them interacting. And you can look at the actual footage of Bob Dylan and Joan Baez in that performance. There's film of that, and it's was reproduced very well. There's a little more like smiling and laughing in the real version, but like they very clearly have a lot of feelings in various ways towards each other in that moment. So yeah, I do think that felt a little shoehorned in, and maybe that's because it didn't like I was like, I don't know if that doesn't quite make sense that she's suddenly back. But yeah, I think it is an overall a successful dynamic in the movie to have all of them. And if I have to choose, again, they both deserve better. But I think he needed to move on, and moving on to Joan to then move on to someone else is I think, again, best for everyone involved. Because I don't think Sylvie would have enjoyed hanging around the Bob Dylan who, as he evolved, I don't think she would have wanted to stay with him.
So just to clarify, in the movie, he cheats on Sylvie with Joan. That never happened? The timing was different?
I mean, it's the Cuban Missile Crisis, so it doesn't count. That's just one of those rules when you're in a couple.
Yeah, it's the Khrushchev rule, and it doesn't count. I don't know about that. It was more around the festival when she is back. Like he goes and picks her up. And
towards
like,
the end of the movie. Yeah.
We're doing this, which is 64, 65. Like that relationship ended by the end of 1962. Now, if he did hook up with Joan Baez in the end of 1962, then yes, there would have been cheating there. I can't profess I know that information. So that may have happened, but the later sort of resurgence of the triangle, when he is kind of struggling with his artistic place in the world, which I think works thematically in the movie because it kind of just feels like he's lashing out at women in his life in a not like directly abusive way, but in a manipulative way to be like, try to get reactions from people is as a mirror for him, try to figure out what art he wants to make and generate reactions for that. I think is interesting in the movie, but it's not necessarily historically accurate.
Yeah, it does feel like that final scene really is a means to an end so that Elle Fanning can have her monologue, the plate spinning monologue. Mm-hmm. Which, to answer my original question, I am on Team Joan all the way, but I still sympathize with Sylvie. Obviously, I'm not heartless, but once I saw the movie, I was like, oh, I guess I really shouldn't have made fun of the National Board of Review giving Elle Fanning the award as opposed to Monica Barbaro. Monica Barbaro very much deserves it also, but I was like, oh, I get it now because she has the real moment. She has the Oscar reel moment where she's like giving it back to him, and really like there are so few moments in this film that are explicitly articulated. I think no one stops like in between. Like I joked earlier that there's not much talking in between songs, but it really does feel like no one stops to be like, you know what this is all about? Let me tell you, until she has that moment at the end. And I feel like a lot of people watching it probably felt so much sense of like closure or kind of climax for the story, because she kind of puts into words things that have been kind of bubbling throughout the movie but never really explicitly said. And so I feel like, yeah, if a narrative thread was Bob Dylan is just so into his own art and he's so famous that he doesn't stop to think about who he's hurting along the way, like that seems to be kind of the main moment for that. So I kind of get why they contrived that situation so that the screenplay could have that moment to be like, in case you haven't been paying attention. But yeah, but I have also heard the criticism that like, isn't this movie just two women looking adoringly at Bob Dylan, or everybody, not even just the two female characters, but that everybody is just staring gobsmacked by Bob Dylan's genius. And I think that's a really reductive way to describe the movie, but it's also not wrong. So I don't know how everybody feels about like, do you feel like the inclusion of these two female characters and the actually pretty extensive focus on them and that culminates in this like sort of love triangle dynamic, like does that help or hurt the movie more?
I think it helps the movie. One of my favorite scenes in the movie was Joan Baez like throwing him out of the room when he's creating music at her desk and sort of like showing off to her, and she just sort of like realizes who he is, what he is, and what their dynamic will always be. And when she has that revelation and then kicks him out. I mean, we have two awesome moments where he's sort of like kicked to the curb by people. And even though this is a more subtle moment, I thought that I thought it said a lot about like her protecting herself and her respecting herself enough to like to not tolerate this anymore. Um, all that being said, you know, even though I'm Team Joan, just because I found that arc a little bit more satisfying and it was sort of nice to see artist versus artist in that moment, I I felt like Elle Fanning to me, she sounded like one of my favorite actresses, Laura Linney, like throughout the movie, and you know, there's the way you mentioned that like a lot of it is just her looking sort of like adoringly or looking with sort of like wet eyes at him, and it's true. That's a lot of the scenes, but like man, were those heartbreaking. Like even though you know there were a lot of them, it never failed to make me it feel like the hurt inside and how difficult that must be to like to love someone on a human level and then to watch them being adored on another level and then realizing and or just constantly being anxious about whether your love is going to be enough, and to always feel like in the shadow of you know all of these adoring fans.
Well, Antonio, please stop implying it. We know you're talking about your ascension to podcast God and how your wife looks at you from off screen while you're zooming with us. Um, I think that was really well said, and and that would be my defense for the kind of glassy-eyed staring in awe is I do think that those moments are essential to kind of see then how awful he treats both of them at different times. And I joked in the opening about that you're kind of an asshole, Bob line, but that is such an important moment where he just feels like he can say whatever he wants without, you know, caring about the reaction to it. And a music bio cliche is where somebody's like tinkling on a piano and then they like suddenly hit on the three notes that you're like, yep, there it is. And what was always funny for me is when Peter Jackson did the big Beatles documentary, it has those moments in it and you're like, they're real. Like they just happen. Like you see Paul McCartney strumming on a guitar and suddenly he hits the right notes and you're like, there it is, right? And yeah, that's the lyric that it's going to be. So I do think part of the fun is to get some of those moments. The credit I want to give to Elle Fanning, because I kind of I joined Team Joan, is that and this goes back to PT's comment about the walk hard problem. Jenna Fisher from The Office plays Dewey Cox's wife and just turns into a pure Nolan sad wife who I think the joke is every time they cut to her, she has more babies hanging off of her, and yet like the babies haven't aged that much. So, or sometimes they do, and it's like a crowd of like 30 kids, and she's just like, "Why can't you stay home? Why do we stay home?" And like it's a really good bit because that's all these female characters tend to get. And so to me, it means a lot that the moment you reference that she gets to stand up to Bob, and it means a lot that she walks away, right, and that he doesn't get that win and doesn't get that you know. To kind of overcome with his art as a part of this. And so I think the ability of those women to stand behind the curtain and thereby see behind the curtain is what part of this film's project is, and to show that genius has a cost within that. And I know that well. I mean, again, as a podcast titan,
Right.
the cost of my genius is bitter.
A lot of a lot of sad-eyed ladies of the Melrose Highlands looking at you. One thing I want to add to all these great points is I think another aspect that works really well is that both of these women do not exist exclusively as women who like Bob Dylan. Like Sylvie has this political activism and gets him into it, and apparently that is accurate to. It was this woman that he met. I guess it is Susie is the name. Susie Ratolan. If I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Great. Now we're getting sued. Thanks a lot.
Well, she's dead. It's fine. She died. I don't know what to tell you. So that like, you know, she brings him into that, but she has this thing. She has stuff she's doing. She had like and when she looks at Bob Dylan with the like, oh my God, it isn't just like, what a masterful artist who's doing these things, but in a similar way that Pete Seeger looks at him, it is, look at this vessel for the message. Look at this person who can reach people, who can do a maybe peak version, or at least a popular version of the kind of music that she takes part researching, or is part of organizations that is connected with the people who are researching this protest music, this folk music, Americana, all these things. So she has that. And obviously Joan Baez has her own work as well. Like, she's writing songs, even if they're described as oil paintings in a dentist office, like she writes incredible songs and has this work. And so there's some degree of both, all of things that Antonio and Greg were saying, of this longing and emotional, like, oh wow, like this person, like, why, why can't this person in real life be this person who is performing right now? Like, why is this not the real version of this? But also like some degree of professional jealousy and connection and just admiration. So, I think it works because these aren't just characters who exist to reflect the light of Bob Dylan, but they have their own thing going on that is established and demonstrated in the movie. So the responses are multifaceted. I will also say one of the reasons why I think this is overcoming some of those cliches in the movies is because of the subject, where if you have him playing The Times They Are A-Changing at an earlier Newport Folk Festival, and everyone is like, oh my God, like, I'm falling in love with this song, and people off stage are falling in love with him for doing it, and the people in the audience are doing it, the subject himself, Bob Dylan, is just like, oh my God, this is stupid, I can't believe these people, like he doesn't like the fact that they're looking at him that way, and he immediately rejects it. And Chalamet, I think, is playing that really well, and has that kind of like small, like not like fully out there all the time, but even at that early stage, a kind of like sneer of disdain that like keeps creeping on his face, to be like, I hate these people are doing this to me, which kind of lets the movie get away with that cliche of like, oh my God, look at that song, it's that famous song, people know this song, and he's like, Christ, I can't believe they're adoring me for this. Like, that attitude feels accurate to the person, but also I think complicates things in the movie, where it's like, oh, he doesn't want this, why do we want this as a reward for our nostalgia for the song?
Yeah, I think Timothée Chalamet really plays it like he's being kind of suffocated by his own popularity, right? And that he actively wants to resist that. But then at the same time is, fine being the beneficiary of it too. Like, I think the movie actually does a pretty good job of establishing, no, he actually seems to enjoy all of the fineries that come with being super famous, and people basically letting him do whatever he wants. Like, he does develop sort of a sense of artistic and personal privilege, where he can just be a jerk to everybody, and people are like, it's fine because he's Bob Dylan. But I think we're starting to move towards talking about kind of the music itself and kind of how that's being portrayed in the movie, and I really want to tackle that in the rhetorical situation, which we usually run out of time and don't do lately. So that's why I'm trying to like fast track us in there. But I want to put us in the rhetorical situation, a segment in which we look at a film from the lens of our academic experience. So all four of our regular co-hosts.
I
was actually
feel?
Greg.
A segment where each of
I was actually I was just thinking about I was just thinking about in reverse. I was like, oh, a folk version of this music actually probably would sound pretty good. Anyway, so all four of our regular co-hosts are writing professors, so we like to have this section of the episode dedicated to making connections to our experience as scholars and teachers. So the big theme I wanted to kind of tackle today that I thought fit with this movie really well, and it's not just because I just gave a presentation on this sort of like 30 minutes ago, but genre. It's a big part of, at least for me, my teaching practice. It's something I have to think about all the time, and I feel like genre is really working in terms of how we would interpret this movie on two levels. I want to talk about both. First, I want to talk about sort of the war over musical genres within the story, right? Because I do think that the idea of like Bob of Dylan going electric, right, and what does that mean, and how people felt about that, and did he belong to folk music, because folk music as a genre seemed to claim ownership of him, right? I want to talk about all that stuff. And then on the sort of more meta level, I think genre is really important in terms of, like, we alluded to this earlier, but how much this adheres to the conventions of the traditional musical biopic versus not. So those are kind of my two agenda items for rhetorical situation. Let's start with, is Pete Seeger the villain of this movie? Because I think your answer to that question kind of largely informs how you feel about what this movie is saying about different genres of music.
I don't know. I don't know about villain. It's hard. He's such a kind whatever, but like he's certainly very control. Like he has a very he knows what he wants Bob to be, and he knows what Bob is to this genre of music. And there's a scene in the film, you alluded to sort of like that Bob Dylan almost has a sort of antipathy toward his audience at a certain point. Um, there's a scene where he's singing with Joan, and the audience just wants, I forget which song
Blown in the
they keep
Wind?
wanting. Oh yeah, Blown in the Wind, right? And he just refuses to do it. And at that moment, I remember, as much as I was sort of like pro Bob all movie, that was the one moment where I was like, come on, Bob. You could, like, all of these people are here. They paid to, like, they just want to hear this one. So you can't just give them that. And at that moment, I'm just like, well, Joan feels like the professional who's like giving the audience what they want. It doesn't seem like it's actually has to be this like choice where you can't be both evolve as an artist and then also give them what they want for him. But for him, it very much is this. So the other thing that I wanted to say though about genre though, because it's obviously him rejecting any box that he's put in, is that another thing about sort of protecting genre. We're recording now on a weekend before the Grammy Awards are about to happen, and one of the big deals this year in music was Beyonce putting out a country album, and part of the reason that she created this album was because she felt at the Country Music Awards, I believe, she was performing and didn't feel like she was really received well. And tellingly this year, even though that she's, I think, the most nominated artist at the Grammys again, for Cowboy Carter, didn't get any nominations at the Country Music Awards. So it's a little bit different. It's a genre of music that is firmly sort of like seems to be trying to exclude her. Whereas here it's Bob Dylan trying to sort of move outside of a genre in which he is sort of firmly established, right? But what's interesting is just this constant sort of like guarding of these lines, and this feeling of like of defining what one type of music is over another type of music, and to the point where certain audiences just like don't care about the personal journeys or whatever, however an artist wants to expand themselves, because like you've fallen in love with this version of that artist, and that feels special to you, and that's what you want. So I was very torn, like in that one moment, like it's just like play the song, Bob, but at the other end, it's like, you know to what extent should we allow artists to sort of like move beyond our why we sort of initially loved them. One of my favorite comedians is John Mulaney, and I remember that after he had like the sort of scandals when he left his wife and stuff, he said something during one of his acts, which is like likability is a prison. um, which was basically like, he had a certain persona, and people just knew him for a certain kind of joke, and now he couldn't do that anymore, and it was freeing in a sense, but it also, I think at the time, when he was going through a lot of troubles, I think it felt sort of stifling. So all of those things sort of came to mind as I was sort of synthesizing the themes of this film. What do you all think?
I also think my likability is a prison. PT? No, I think that was really well said. And I was thinking about when I teach genre. So I teach genre each fall as one of the kind of primary units in my Writing 101 course. And, it's a funny concept to bring up to students because they're immediately familiar with it and yet don't understand its kind of larger significance in discourse. And so I use an article that's called At the Intersection of Text and Interpretation. And, I think for all of us, this would feel remedial, but it's like really eye-opening to students, the fact that genre is a social construction, right? Like all the other social constructive concepts we talk about in today's academic discourse. And the idea that, somewhere there's a negotiation between what the author puts on the page and what the audience adds to that or interprets about that. And because I always end up teaching it in like late October, I always ask the class, what is a horror movie? What defines that genre? And we fill the board with all the things that should be there. And then I say, now what has to be there? And that's where the conversation takes a turn and students really kind of struggle and they fight it out productively, right? And somebody says there has to be blood, and somebody else says like, no, I watched a horror movie with no blood, it's got to be dark and ominous. And somebody's like, but I saw Midsommar and blah 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 blah. And like all of this kind of gets fought out in the class. And I do think when we look at the way folk music is approached by this film, I think that's the core concept, that Pete Seeger, as one of the core kind of people experiencing the Bob Dylan phenomenon, has a very specific definition of folk music that has to be stripped down and kind of that base level of just a singer with a guitar telling a message. And Bob Dylan is refocusing that and challenging that in kind of complicated ways. The other metaphor that's really helpful in that article is to think about genre as a constellation. And this is where I draw on the whiteboard, and I draw the dots that make up Leo the lion. And I'm like, look at these dots. Aren't they beautiful? And they're like, no. And then I connect them into the kind of coat hanger looking shape. And I'm like, boom. And they're like, what are you doing? Are you ill? Like, why is this? And then I very haphazardly draw a lion around it. And I explain the kind of basic concept that this doesn't have meaning. These dots could be connected in any way, but we turn that into Leo the lion. And then in astrology, we attach so much more meaning to that. So I think the movie at its core is about that tension between the text and the interpretation, who Bob Dylan sees himself as and who the audience sees him as. And because I made fun of him earlier, I'll end this rant with Guillermo del Toro pointed out something very cool about this movie, which is Bob Dylan, from the moment we meet him, is driven by somebody, right? So he's hitchhiking and he's in the back of a car. Then he has a driver and all this. And it's only in the moments where he decides to go electric that he starts driving himself, and he grabs the motorcycle and sets his own course. And to me, that's the kind of symbolic representation of this, that at the end of the day, he's going to create his art and the interpretation is going to kind of lag behind and maybe be angry, maybe feature fistfights and people smashing soundboards with hammers or whatever it was. That's the part that if anybody wants to criticize that, I'm here for it. But that, that's going to be the reaction. We're not there.
I love the editing in that scene where it's like Edward Norton, it like shows him and then it cuts to looking at the sledgehammers that we'd seen the other group using, and he cuts back to his face. It's a very Wes Anderson moment, to be honest, where he's just like, oh, I could do that. Like,
so a couple things. First, to come in as the person who's like, I know more about Bob Dylan than all of you guys. I don't know if people know. I was about to go into teacher mode and be, does anybody know? But that's not interesting. That the whole thing of him being on a motorcycle is actually quite Lawrence of Arabia, because basically within a year after the timeline of this movie, he's in a motorcycle accident and he doesn't tour for a decade. And it's there's some people who speculate that he actually was never in a motorcycle accident. He just wanted to cut his ties with his manager and promoter who kept booking him for shows he didn't want to do. And he just said, actually, I crashed my motorcycle. I can't do that tour. Actually, I'm not touring anymore. I'm just going to do my own music on my own in my home studio for the next 8 or 9 years. So that for me, once he got on the motorcycle, it's like, oh, this is inevitably leading to that next phase of independence, which is also potentially the next phase of self-harm, which kind of ties into a lot of his behavior of undermining himself while also exploring his own creativity. So I thought that was interesting. everything around their axes, and they are not sledgehammers. It was an axe act, and it's because there is a longstanding rumor that Pete Seeger went to grab one of the axes to cut one of the wires. That's not made up for the movie. That's a real thing. But it seemed like, from when I was looking into it, the source is that when Dylan and his band left the stage and they had done a full electric performance of only a few songs, and the audience was like split. Some people were mad, some people were happy, that whoever went up next as the MC said something like, well, Pete's going to go and grab his axe, which axe meaning guitar. And they thought like that. The assumption is that what he means is Pete Seeger's going to come back out with his acoustic guitar to do a normal thing, even though that wasn't scheduled. But then that got repeated over time as he went to get an axe to stop the electricity from being an electrical performance. So anyway, all of that being said, I can't remember what I was going to say about the actual like thing that was being discussed here. So I'll throw it back to you, Jen.
Well, I was going to add that when I teach genre to students, granted, I don't do this often enough, I think, but I try to not just help them learn the conventions of a given genre, but to kind of explain to them that you have to learn the rules in order to break them and kind of move, like, because if you think, to go back to Greg's example, like, yes, you can kind of make a checklist for what makes a horror movie, but what makes like a really popular new hotness kind of horror movie is probably something that's kind of adding something to that list, right? Like if we think about Get Out or something like that, right? Like it's kind of using elements of thriller and horror and like doing this kind of, you know, high concept thing with race and stuff. You know what I mean? Like you could point to the best of a genre and sort of identify where the following the convention ended and incorporating new things began. And when thinking about the portrayal of Bob Dylan in this movie, to me, actually, the thing I appreciated the most was kind of, and I think this is partly why, if I had to come up with like a really good reason, this is partly why it's kind of the relentless song after song after song where we never leave music, right? I think part of that is because they show many different kinds of music, and then it becomes very clear how that is influencing Bob Dylan's next song. Like for me, I keep coming back to the Pete Seeger's TV show, and he has that blues player on, right? And then when Dylan shows up, and what's so great about the dynamic between those two characters through the whole movie, but especially in this scene, is Pete Seeger seems like he wants to be very controlled and managed about like, okay, this is what we do. Here's this is what we're all about, right? And like next we're gonna play a song, right? Like, and he has this kind of very specific way he wants, and if we veer from that, like we're in trouble, right? Whereas Dylan he comes in late. He sits down, but the blues player responds to him, and they end up like in this crazy jam session, and it very organically, the different genres of music kind of collide, right? And then you can sort of see how, and there's also the scene where he's going to the like concert in the church, right? There's a lot of blues music throughout the movie in a way that I really appreciated. Like no one came out and said, well, you know, blues is actually a part of folk music. Like no one made any like manifesto about what music is, right? But at the same time, that felt very much like a subtext of the whole movie through the performances they showed.
I did remember my points because of the great points that you were making, Jen, about the sort of mixing of the genres and the overlap. And it's sort of both the genres of music, as well as I think part of why it's effective as a sort of execution of the music biopic genre is, it wasn't here's someone's entire life. It wasn't like, here's the sort of cradle to grave story of a musician. And it didn't even it didn't try to cover all of that. It just, it stayed focused. And instead of, you could try to make a movie, and I think it wouldn't have been good. And there's many ways this movie couldn't have been good. And this is one of them, is to make a movie about Bob Dylan in the early to mid 60s. That's about the impact he had as a songwriter, like changing people's minds about things. And he performing at the, Freedom Riders little like get together, which I think we get maybe a little reference to. That there is a scene in I'm Not There talking about that. or showing that. But that's okay, like, sure, but it's also weird to be like, did Bob Dylan really like cause all these things in the 60s? That would be awkward. And so instead it's this very like insular fight between the different genres of like the folk music people want him to be one thing and the rock people want him to be other things. And like what like came across to me in the movie is that Pete Seeger and his friends in the folk music scene just were these like true believers. I don't mean that to be too disparaging, but they were just really believers in, we are telling these stories in this traditional way through these songs, and that will change people's minds, and that by in turn will change the world. And so when they see him and it's like, well, this guy's going to reach way more people than we ever did, we're going to be able to actually change things. Like, this is going to have a productive impact on society. And they think that once he picks up an electric guitar, he's not going to do that anymore. That it's something about the genre itself and the context of just a man with a guitar and maybe that little harmonica stand that makes him look like Darth Vader when he takes the helmet off. That thing, like that, like helps like make the people focus on the message. And if it's all this other stuff, they're going to be dancing. It's going to feel like pop music. It's really interesting because if you look at the actual lyrics that Dylan was writing, the line, like if you just read the lyrics, the line is not that blurred between the sort of protest era of the Times They Are a Changin' album and the Free Will and Bob Dylan album into Highway 61 Revisited, where it's full electric like a Rolling Stone and Tom Thumb's Blues and all those other songs that like they like the lyrics are still have this social commentary, and it has this, maybe they grow more and more obtuse because he gets a little bit weirder and weirder. But like, I if I think of two of my favorite Bob Dylan songs, there's the like very classic folk era from Free Will and Bob Dylan, centerpiece of the movie, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. And then there's like a Rolling Stone, like super famous, and it's the big rock song where he got all the electric guitar and he has the organ, and it's the thing everyone's mad about in the movie. And that's also true in reality. The lyrics are not that different because it's basically like, I don't like you, woman who did me wrong, and I'm making fun of you. Like, there's nothing really like there's more political components in the Like a Rolling Stone than there is in Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. But they got so fixated on the genre, at least in the setup of the movie, and I guess to some degree in real life, they got so fixated on not just what's in the genre, to Greg's point about like what are the elements we need, but that it's the only place that could exist. It's the only way that message could get across, and the only way music could do that, that they just got reflexively mad at anything changing it. Maybe that also coincides with him being Dylan, actively rejecting this sort of like messiah role or this leadership role of, like, you can be the face of a movement. He's just like, I'm not doing that. I'm going to do whatever it is I'm going to do. But that could have happened just as easily with an acoustic guitar, but they wouldn't have been as mad because they were so wedded to the genre and what they had invested their energy and lives into as the promise of what that genre was going to accomplish.
Pete Seeger seems to fixate on folk music is defined by how it sounds and what you play it on, whereas Dylan would argue, no, it's actually about the ethos and the spirit of what a folk singer is trying to convey through the music. It doesn't matter if it's electric or acoustic. It's about kind of, and I think the movie sort of portrays it as like he would see his songs on a continuum, not as like a break of like when he went electric, right?
To PT's point about the sort of impact of his work, I actually, one of our colleagues, Jim Clements, I was in one of his classes, and heard him give a lecture basically about the impact of Bob Dylan during this time, and it was fascinating. And of course, it was very well done. And but I think that he's right that that's not the move of the movie. And Jen, at the beginning, you talked about how part of what made this unique was just how much it relied just on the songs. But to me, given what we now understand of Bob Dylan, there's no more Bob Dylan move than to let the songs do the work, right? And to let the messages of the songs and the aesthetics of the songs, like, let it speak for themselves. Uh, the other thing that I wanted to point out, like PT saying that there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of things that we can see in common despite the different eras. Bob Dylan. I don't know if you all know this, but there is, on top of all these other things that we've already talked about, I'm Not There, and there probably is, there's documentaries on Bob Dylan as well, right? Um, there was a musical, like a jukebox musical called "Girl from the North Country" that was nominated for a Tony. It came to LA recently. I didn't get to see it because I couldn't convince anyone to watch the music. I made them watch the movie, but I couldn't convince anyone to go watch it on stage. The first time I actually ever heard Like a Rolling Stone was watching the Tony Awards, watching Mayor Winningham sing this song. So anyway, but the fact that like his collection of music could have inspired this range of like secondary work, not secondary work, but just like spin-offs of his work, right? Takes on his work. It's just, it speaks to the depth of like what he was saying, and the resonance um uh of those messages.
I'm not going to be very smart right now, but I want to say one of the choices I love that fits into this conversation, or this part of our conversation, is that we start. I believe the first musical number of the film is Woody Guthrie's. It's actually Pete Seeger singing the "This Land Is Your Land." And it reminds me of the great fake person Llewyn Davis again, saying that there's a quote at the beginning of that film that is, "If it was never new and it never gets old, then it's a folk song." And I had this experience recently where as is portrayed in the film, "This Land Is Your Land" is like a deeply socialist song, and it's like so embodies a very different definition of America. And I spent the last 4th of July in a town here in Massachusetts that is actually deeply red as a town. And like we got to the like, let's raise the flag. And all around me are, super conservative, like if you kneel for the flag, I'm not standing for you, or whatever, bumper stickers on every car. And then that song plays and everybody's singing along and feeling it like so deeply. And there's a way in which I wanted to be cynical of that. But I do think what the movie demonstrates about genre, and this was very roundabout to get to this, is that when the message is there, or when it is a moving experience, that's where the genre is based. It is based in what we take from it and what we learn from it. And Jen, I'm going to jump back to like 10 questions ago. Pete Seeger isn't the villain to me because he doesn't see that. He's just the old guard failing to recognize the rise of the new guard. And again, to tease out that text versus audience moment, for me, my favorite musical number in this is "The Times They Are A-Changing," which PT alluded to it. And you realize he is performing that song for the first time, and by the time the song is over, he no longer owns it, right? The crowd has taken it over, has made it their own. And to me, that's what wait, Jen, maybe play the thesis, please.
Thesis, please.
I love you, Andor. I love you now more than ever. We need Andor deep in our hearts every minute of every day. What I think the thesis of this movie is that Bob Dylan had this incredible power to ride the crest of a wave. He wasn't the wave, and he wasn't the one creating the wave, but he rode it just right at this moment to create something that truly defined a generation. And it had its costs, and he was not an awesome guy at all times. But what mattered instead was the way he was received and what he meant to people, not just who he was. That's what I think the thesis of the film is.
I can definitely see that. And I think that related to it is the main criticism, which Jen mentioned earlier, at least for me, the main criticism that makes the most sense, which is that like, what did we learn here? Like, what did we learn, Palmer, about Bob Dylan having watched this whole movie? It's like, I don't know, like he wrote some songs, I guess. I think that's the right choice, because I think trying to define who he is would be very disappointing if there was some sort of like, let me tell you my secret. At 4/5 of the way in, he opens the door a little bit to someone who would be like, I don't know. But I this is a weird comparison, but I had a similar trajectory of positive experience watching this movie as I did the first time I watched The Dark Knight. When like The Dark Knight had that moment where it's like the Joker's like, do you want to know how I got these scars? I'm going to tell you this backstory. And like, I remember being like, oh, okay, they're going to do that. And then as it became clear that like, oh no, he's not going to, like, that changes each time, which, you know, forgive me, the movie's ingrained in everyone's brains. But at the time, in the moment, I was bummed that like, oh, we're going to have a standard Joker backstory. Similarly, I think when they tried to be like, oh, this circus thing, or like, you know, she's got his yearbook and then she can go through his yearbook to see these photos. I thought they were going to try to find something from Minnesota that was like the key to understanding Bob Dylan. But like, no, they never did that. Like, they just are like, yeah, he's like, he's mercurial, and maybe that's because he's a mysterious, creative, artistic force that could just, you know, channel or birth these songs. Or maybe, you know, he's just a big old jerk, and like you don't want to know him because he's mean to everybody. So just like what he produced, but that, you know, it like the as part of the thesis, the fact that it doesn't matter who he is and it doesn't matter where this came from, just that he was able to produce this and have the impact that he had. The work is what is important, not necessarily any of the process or, you know, who this person was who was doing the process.
For me, I feel like the thesis of this movie might actually be more an answer to a question. And that question is, how do you make a biopic about the enigmatic Bob Dylan? And the answer is you don't. The answer is you don't try to essentialize his biography and his identity, and you lean into the fact that he's like this vortex where we can never access his interiority. And I think that's, again, partially why the movie is like, no, the songs are what are speaking for him. That's all we have. That's all we can reliably use to unlock who he was. We're not going to contrive, which many other biopics try to do, right? We're not going to contrive some narrative that kind of encapsulates who he was or what he meant to history or like any of those other things that biopics I think usually try to do. And instead we're going to kind of like embrace the lack that is at the center of his story, which kind of brings me to my next question of, because I did want to talk about this as a music biopic, like how far does it go in terms of traditional versus non-traditional? Because I've heard from critics, I've heard both ways. I've heard people be like, this is nothing more than your standard, like, play all the hits kind of musical biopic. And then I've heard other people be like, no, this doesn't fall into most of the traps of a traditional music biopic. So what are your thoughts on how it is comparing to its own genre?
Thanks, Jen. Bohemian Rhapsody is bullshit. Back to you, PT and Antonio. Well, I want to take your question seriously, which is like, I think that, and I said this, I believe, on our LTR episode, that James Mangold sees the way the genre has become a parody of itself and just does this brilliant, like, I'm going to do the cliches, but I'm going to shoot them so well you can't ignore the cliches and you have to enjoy that. But where I have seen those criticisms, I think we all saw David Chen was out very early with like, this is just a like incredible waste of time. Like, it's just you know, hagiography of I never say that word right, but of hagiography of Bob Dylan, and we don't need that. But where I think this transcends, and I'm gonna just say it plainly because I think it really matters. You said it in your opening. Everybody sings and everybody actually cares about the music. And by putting that central focus on it, you get that fulfillment of, I'm at a live concert experience, but you also get to understand those in a different way and put them into a context that opens them up for a lot of us who either forgot the context or didn't know the context. So to me, that's what a biopic does at its best. And I actually would love to hear from all of you where you think this genre has worked for you recently, because for me, I actually put Rocket Man pretty high on this list, Academy Award nominee Elton John, just because it tried to do something different. And we don't need to talk more about Better Man, but it tried to do something different with this. And I think that's where we're at. Whereas for me, something like Elvis or Bohemian Rhapsody that really just becomes the jukebox. Remember this song you love? Here it is. Struggles in a different way.
I like about how I agree with Greg. I don't think that this is a standard biopic at all. I think what a standard biopic would do is they would situate the content of the songs with like given things in with things in his life, with things in his biography, right? And it would attach them to that, and that's how we get the inspiration for the songs. And that's sort of what I'm conditioned to sort of understand. My guess is that's what like the musical, like the theater musical version of this does. What I like about this that I think is like singular to this film and to this presentation of Bob Dylan that is the right move is that I think that this is the first movie where I felt the sort of like dissatisfaction of an artist with themselves and with the reason why artists constantly evolve. If you ask a writer what their favorite thing that they've ever written is, then my guess is that for most of them they're going to say like what I'm writing right now. Because why else would you be compelled to like sit down and do this if you didn't think that like what you were doing right now was the most important thing? The other thing that I'm often struck by when I hear artists talk about their work is that their favorite of whatever, they've done is rarely the most popular thing that they've ever done. And it's often for some sort of idiosyncratic reason, something that's very personal to them, something that was very important to their development. And so they view their success outside of the prism of how audiences just take it. And that's not necessarily a sign of an antipathy toward the audience, so much as that, if this is what you do, if art is what you do, then I could imagine it would be very dissatisfying to sort of feel like you just had to do the same version of the same thing over and over and over again, because artists are just like are regular people too who want to evolve, who evolve and who change and who are excited by that movement, by that evolution over time. You get wiser and your art changes as a result. And if the and I think that too often, the we view or the media or audiences view someone's success based on box office, based on awards, based on whatever. Um, and that's how we view someone, right? Like if for example an actor, you get those like Us Weekly articles where like what happened to this actor who won an Oscar like 20 years ago? We haven't seen them before, right? And the conclusion seems to be, the sort of implicit conclusion is, well, their life just like suffered, like they did this bad film and now their lives are bad, right? But that's not necessarily what the evolution is, both in terms of like what their artistry is, what their lives look like. And so I found the presentation here to be sort of like, I think that the fact that I couldn't put my finger on the pulse of like exactly what it was trying to do while it was happening, I think was to the credit of the film. And again, is right for this particular artist.
That's really well said, Antonio. And I think this is a good opportunity to transition over to Oscars Watch. Okay, so as I teased earlier, this movie has some serious Oscar heat right now because it kind of overperformed on nominations morning. But let's step back a little bit. What do you feel like this is reasonable to win potentially?
Jen, can I take your beautiful question and throw it back to you? So here's how I understand the current Oscar moment. Everybody sees extreme weakness in the front runners, and that Complete Unknown, the name of the film we're talking about, that has the potential to kind of close in when all those weaknesses come to fruition. Jen, question number 1, is that right? And question number 2, why? And then we'll let the other numbers come through from the other two.
Well, there are two ways to look at it. One is purely based on the preferential ballot, right? That like no one's come out hating this movie. And in fact, most people, the floor for response to this movie is, oh, I really like that. Maybe it wasn't like the deepest thing I've ever seen, but I really enjoyed it, right? Like no one is going below that necessarily. And so that makes it a good candidate for people who are ranking their votes. Maybe it's their number 2, maybe it's their number 3, that pushes it up to at least winning Best Picture, right? But I think the other argument for it is that it's just in a lot of categories, and in a lot of those categories, if you wipe out the people who have kind of like are falling, a lot of times who's left is from a complete unknown. So for example, Emilia Perez is under fire right now for various reasons, which we're not going to get into necessarily, but it has a target on its back because it led the nominations, right? So now everyone's like, oh no, this film can't win Best Picture. What are we doing? But and the other thing to say is that for The Brutalist, it's the same thing with like the AI controversy. So there are all these films kind of like sinking under the like slugfest that is Oscar season right now, apparently. And so if you look at something like director, no one's saying James Mangold is at the top for director, but if the frontrunner Brady Corbet's out, and like who's the argument for who's next, does he sneak in there, right? And I think you could say the same thing. Like if The Brutalist is falling, Timothée Chalamet is right there to overtake Adrian Brody. Supporting actor, people are like, well, Real Pain didn't get into Best Picture, so maybe we can't be so confident in Kieran Culkin winning that category. A lot of people, the counter argument is like, no, that'll be the one win for that movie, and that's it. But again, if you take out Kieran Culkin, I think Edward Norton's like lurking right behind him, according to a lot of people, because a lot of people love his performance in this movie. So there's just a lot of Oscar math that's being kind of played out. Like, what if this gets, Best Picture directors, or like it starts to add up. Like if this gets director, if it gets actor and supporting actor, and like the momentum builds and builds and builds, and like how do you deny it getting Best Picture at that point? You know what I mean? Like if it gets that plus like something like sound, or you see what I'm saying? Like,
well explained. Thank you for that. That was exactly the answer I wanted, and you delivered admirably.
It is sound and costume design are its below
Thank
the
you.
line nominations, which makes sense. I think that all makes sense. I also think that's just, to continue a trajectory, it feels like this is a year that maybe goes against some of the standard ways we think about this, just because of the lack of a clear, again, there's arguments to be made about like who's front running and who's not in the race, but it hasn't felt like, oh, it's this movie in the way that there has been frequently. And so
when is the opportunity going to come around again? And the argument I think they were making was that like Adrian Brody might have that same draw of like Timothée Chalamet is going to keep making movies for a long time, right? He's got plenty of time. We can get him on the next one. Whereas Adrian Brody, his Golden Globe speech, if you recall, was kind of like, I never thought I'd be up here again, right? And so he like, if it's a last chance kind of narrative, that could pull him out front.
I can definitely see, I could see either of them winning. That feels like a real fight. That's going to be one of many, I think, categories where we got to look to see what happens in the next few weeks at the other precursors that have not occurred yet, especially SAG, to see how they vote. And if there's been any impact on that voting from the various sniping controversies. Some of the controversies are real, and I don't want to discredit them for being PR based, but they are also PR based. I think there's all that. I think the other, I guess there's part of me that in my heart wants to believe that if there is a turn on Kieran Culkin winning for supporting actor, that the person who steps in is Guy Pearce, because I think Guy Pearce was incredible in The Brutalist, and I love Edward Norton, and I love Edward Norton in this movie, but I would rather Guy Pearce win it. That does seem possible. I also wonder if it is felt kind of like one of the few, okay, we know this at least, is that Conclave's going to win adapted screenplay. I wonder if it's possible that if people are getting their votes together and they're like, oh, I voted for Brody, I voted for Culkin, I voted for, whatever I voted for picture and director, I should vote for a complete unknown somewhere. I'm going to vote for it in adapted screenplay, even though I feel like I don't know who's sitting around being like, wow, what a screenplay. They really set up all those songs well. But all these sort of story things we were talking about earlier and the pieces of the dynamics between the individual characters and the relationships between them and the way they stand in for some of these debates around art and meaning and all of that. That's it has to be in the screenplay, or that has to be in how the story, the choices made in telling the story. So, I don't think that would be so bad. And I feel like it is possible. The most likely is Best Actor for Chalamet. But I feel like second most likely for me, if it just wins one award, would be a weird screenplay. What feels now like a weird screenplay win, but also could just be like, yeah, people like the movie. They wanted to give it something somewhere.
I wanted to just shout out that I think Monica Barbara's nomination is the award. The fact that she got in, it's highly unlikely. But I was thinking about how Best Supporting Actress is usually first, right? They throw in those 2 supporting actor awards. And like, if somehow she gets that early in the night, then you're like, yeah, it's all over. Like, it has to be complete unknown running the table. So, but I would say, first for that race remains Zoe Saldana. I think all the criticisms about Emilia Perez don't include hers. She is such a great performer and is such a major part of Hollywood that hasn't been recognized in the last few years. The cynical take is she's made a lot of people in this town a lot of money, so she'll get it. But even if that collapses, I would say it probably goes from her to Ariana Grande, and then maybe even still to Isabella Rossellini before you get down to Monica Barbaro. So I don't think it will happen, but I was really pleased to see that nomination, and I think it's there. I just today in my classes taught the idea of cognitive dissonance. And one of the things that's on my mind is like the only time Adrian Brody and Timothée Chalamet have gone head to head on TV in an award show is the Golden Globes, and Adrian Brody took it. And yet it seems to me the predominant wisdom is the dominant narrative is that it's Timothée Chalamet's to lose. And I can't quite reconcile those facts in my head. So I think my hope is that I think this is a more demanding part than The Brutalist. So I want to see Timothée Chalamet win, but I can't get on board with all those predictors that you all just cited.
I'd say it's actually more of an even split. I don't think everyone's on I think people are like, well, if I have to choose, maybe it's Timothée Chalamet, but I don't know if there's the extent of confidence in that prediction.
It also feels a little bit like, oh, this movie has momentum. Where is it going to?
Yeah.
It's not going to leave empty-handed, right? So where is it going to get something? I mean, costume seems pretty locked into Wicked. Sound seems pretty locked into Dune. So it's like, okay, it's not down there. Like, if it's not winning best, it's not winning these other categories, I guess, actor. But I think you're right, Greg. It's just, the evidence as of now is that Adrian Brody is still the front runner, and it is possible this movie gets whatever it got, 8 nominations, and this is the movie that gets the high number of nominations and doesn't win anything. It'd probably be a bummer, be a shame, but it's possible.
Definitely possible, definitely a bummer. I think this conversation has largely wrapped up, but we would be remiss if we closed for the evening without one last question to Jen. Jen, the name Boyd Holbrook has not come up whatsoever in
Travesty.
17 hours of recording. So could you just share why he's the better Johnny Cash?
I was going to say, I was just trying to be polite and not be like, Boyd Holbrook is amazing. So that's why I didn't kind of assert myself. But so I went down kind of a music listening rabbit hole today while I was working. And I was like, okay, I'm going to listen to the Complete Unknown soundtrack, which honestly holds up on its own. Like, I didn't mind listening to it as music, like not even like trying to be like, oh, let me remember the movie. I just kind of had it on. But then I was like, okay, I'm going to listen to Boyd Holbrook's version of Folsom Prison. Then I'm going to listen to Joaquin Phoenix's version of Folsom Prison. And then I'm going to listen to Johnny Cash's version.
Wow.
And yeah, I told you it was a rabbit hole. And I did all of that before I did that for Dylan or Jump Bias, just so you know. Like I was, because I didn't and you know what's interesting? I was like, well, I know so much more about Johnny Cash than Bob Dylan. Why is that? It's probably because of Walk the Line. I'm being honest. So it's really kind of like a catch-22 type situation. Anyway, and I feel like Boyd Holbrook is just so much better. It's embarrassing. It's like because he actually sounds like he's trying to sing and enjoy singing. Whereas if you go back and listen to Joaquin Phoenix, it feels so forced. Like he's like, I have studied Johnny Cash's voice for hours and years, and now I'm going to completely capture his every cadence and intonation. And it's like he's trying so hard, and it just doesn't come. Whereas like if I think about Boyd Holbrook, he has that kind of like playfulness and kind of rebellion, and like he's kind of he's rascally in a way that Joaquin Phoenix never was in portraying. Joaquin Phoenix was so dour and like self-serious in a way that like I think probably worked in the context of Walk the Line, but Boyd Holbrook in A Complete Unknown is just a breath of fresh air. And I didn't know he was friends with Bob Dylan. I was like, is this an MCU movie? Like, what are we doing? Like it's like the team up of the century. I love it. So that was super fun because I was like, that can't be. They must be making that up for this movie. And no, it turns out they did write letters to each other and everything. It sounds like it's everything in the movie for those two characters, or I shouldn't say characters, those two musicians, artists were true. I don't know. Can PT confirm?
I think that was pretty true. I don't believe that Johnny Cash crashed a car into two other cars while telling Bob Dylan to live his life and go electric at the festival, even if it would make people mad. But he was addicted to a lot of pills, and he was very thin at the time, and living, probably what is the least good version of his life, but maybe the most fun version externally of him as a performer and a star, which maybe is to the benefit of Boyd Holbrook. He gets to just be fun Johnny Cash. He doesn't have to be the like strung out on heroin and almost losing his wife Johnny Cash that Joaquin Phoenix had to deal with as well, which may be why he got a little more dour in the movie. But yeah, I'm ready for Walk the Line to be rebooted and remade with Boyd Holbrook. Let's do it. Let's see what happens. Has Boyd Holbrook ever been in a James Mangold movie before? Jen?
Oh, that's right. See, he's such a different character in that. What range?
Mostly just wanted to see if I could get you to do the sound clip again.
He's also been in Logan too, right? I think he's been in most James Mangold movies.
Oh,
so, yeah.
Okay.
He's in 310 to Yuma. I'm almost certain.
Okay,
as well. Young little boy.
I have forgotten that because I liked him as Johnny Cash so much that I completely compartmentalize him as like a low key Nazi. Like, so
if you are. If you like the connection between the two, outside of it being Boyd Holbrook and Timothée Chalamet, there are at least songs, if not a full album, that Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash recorded together around like in the late 60s, early 70s. So you can find those recordings and listen to them sing together.
Can this movie have a sequel in which we bring back Boyd Holbrook and it's just the adventure? I would watch an entire series of just the adventures of Bob and Johnny.
Yeah.
With those two actors.
Slow down, my friend. James Mangold has a Star Wars movie to make.
Oh, that's right.
Don't forget.
Never mind.
He's off to a galaxy far, far away, I believe, as his next project, if it happens. So
just the moment when he's like integral to, he's like the pivot point of the movie, if you think about it. See, Greg, this is why I didn't say anything earlier. You're getting me started. Because when at the last Newport Festival, when he's talking to him and like it's this whole crisis of like, oh, is he gonna do his electric thing? Is he gonna listen to the Pete Seeger and the others and go more traditional? They're really arguing about his performance, and it's Johnny Cash is like, just go kick some mud on the rug. Like he's like, like he that's probably not actually the line, but he tells him to rebel, right? Yeah. He's like, don't let them tell you what to do. Don't let them put you in a box. Nobody puts baby in the corner, right?
Don't walk the line. Do what you want.
There you go.
It was go track some mud on somebody's carpet.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I just loved it. I love that moment.
I agree.
Great moment.
Good movie.
And this was a good episode, I will say. Antonio, where can folks find you? Hopefully not kicking mud on somebody's rug, but I think there's only one place. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Letterboxd at Aelefano, Aelefano. Greg, where can people find you?
Also on Letterboxd at Ion Cannon, EYEONCANON. Follow me now as I continue my Oscar death race. 2 features and 11 shorts left. We're going to get this done easily. I got plans for everything. PT, where can people find you also watching everything nominated for an Oscar this year?
5 weeks out, and Greg is already there. I probably won't see everything for Oscars this year, but you can see if I rise to Greg's challenge or wilt away by following me on Letterboxd at PT McNiff, PTMCNIFF. You can also follow the show there at LTR Pod, or as mentioned earlier, you can follow us on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at The Long Take Review. You can send us an email, thelongtakereview@gmail.com. Or you can subscribe wherever you are getting your podcast, wherever you're listening right now. Subscribe, leave a rating, leave a review, and leave a comment if you have any. Jen, where can folks find you?
You can find me on Letterboxd watching random Studio Ghibli movies, because that's what I can watch with my kids, at Qui-Gon Jen. And you can find me on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at Sopchockchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI.
Goodbye is too good a word, babe, so I'll just say fare thee well.
So
It
it's
ain't me, babe.
fare
It
thee
ain't me.
well, my darling.